The capital was sinking under the weight of its own silence. Washington's streets glimmered with the dull light of a government running on fumes. A city where power had become theater and exhaustion was the only constant. The shutdown had stretched longer than any before it. Federal workers filled coffee shops with the same expression, resignation masked as patience. The air was thick with static, the kind that precedes a storm, and at the heart of it stood Chuck Schumer, orchestrating what he believed would be a masterstroke. The plan was simple, at least on paper. He would leverage paralysis as pressure, turning the machinery of government itself into a bargaining chip. The issue chosen was healthcare subsidies, the lifeblood of the Affordable Care Act. Hundreds of billions funneled to insurance companies under the banner of compassion. The Senate Majority Leader believed he could corner the White House by holding the system hostage. The longer the government remained shut, the more the pain would spread through the country. Federal workers unpaid, airports slowing, military families stretched thin. Eventually, the public would beg for relief, and Trump would be forced to yield. It was classic Washington arithmetic: control the suffering, and you control the outcome. The media performed its familiar ritual. Cameras fixed on the Capitol dome. Commentators spoke in grim tones about leadership and responsibility. Newspapers painted Schumer as the rational adult, a steady hand against chaos. Polling seemed to favor him, showing public frustration growing against the administration. Washington's old guard felt the rhythm of predictability returning, the comfortable symmetry of crisis and blame. Yet the assumption buried inside the strategy was its fatal flaw. It depended on Trump behaving like every president before him, on the idea that pressure would produce compromise. But Trump had built his power by refusing the logic of tradition. He did not fold under heat. He waited until opponents revealed their hand, then turned their moves against them. Schumer's office rolled out what was branded as a compromise proposal. A calm, measured offer to restore funding while extending the subsidies Democrats claimed were essential. The script was perfect, a compassionate appeal to protect families and stabilize markets. Headlines called it reasonable, moderate, sensible governance. What they didn't spotlight was the fine print: billions in benefits that flowed directly into the pockets of the same insurance conglomerates that dominated the healthcare industry. Corporations whose profits rose even as premiums stayed high. The deal, beneath its language of empathy, was an enormous windfall for companies long adept at hiding behind moral rhetoric. Trump waited just long enough for the story to harden. Then, without warning, he detonated the entire narrative. His statement arrived without preamble, as a simple message to the public. If Washington wanted to spend hundreds of billions on healthcare, why not give that money directly to the American people and let them decide how to use it? The idea landed like an earthquake. The concept, government funds for individuals instead of corporations, wasn't new. But the timing and framing were surgical. Overnight, Trump had transformed a technical budget fight into a moral referendum. Cable news hosts stumbled to react. Analysts scrambled for footing. Democrats who had positioned themselves as defenders of working families suddenly found themselves accused of protecting insurance giants. For years, the party had railed against corporate greed. Now, they were cornered into defending it. The framing was brutal, and it worked because it inverted expectations so completely. Trump had moved the fight from policy into philosophy. The question was no longer how much to spend, but who should be trusted with control, bureaucrats or citizens. The country responded instinctively. Comment threads, talk shows, and morning radio lit up with a single refrain: if the money was meant for people, why not give it to them? The populist clarity of the idea cut through decades of technocratic language. It didn't matter whether the logistics were practical. What mattered was that it felt right. Democratic offices scrambled. The talking points that had sounded confident days before now felt brittle. Calling Trump's plan unrealistic or reckless didn't resonate. Those words sounded like excuses. To many Americans, the proposal symbolized something larger, a chance to reclaim control from a system that treated them like numbers. Inside the White House, Trump let the storm unfold. Advisors described a strange calm, a confidence that came from knowing he'd reframed the entire battlefield. He didn't need to win the policy argument, he had already won the narrative. Schumer's move, designed to pressure the administration, had instead exposed the weakness of the very structure he was defending. Editorial pages began to shift tone. The Wall Street Journal called Trump's idea provocatively simple. The New York Times published cautious analyses acknowledging that Schumer's subsidies disproportionately benefited insurers. For the first time in weeks, the president wasn't the villain of the shutdown, he was the disruptor revealing its absurdity. The establishment's own language, equity, accountability, fairness, had been weaponized against it. By the time the Senate returned to session, the air had changed. A few Democrats, sensing the danger, whispered about exploring alternatives. Republican senators who had been silent for weeks rushed to align with Trump's vision. The notion of direct healthcare accounts, a phrase barely understood a month earlier, had become a rallying cry for a new wave of populist economics. Schumer felt the shift but couldn't admit it aloud. His confidence, once unshakable, had turned brittle. The polls began to tilt. Reporters asked questions that once would have seemed absurd. Why were Democrats defending corporate subsidies? The trap he had built for Trump had reversed direction. The longer the shutdown lasted, the worse his own position became. Washington's most seasoned operators recognized what had happened. The game had changed. Trump hadn't just resisted pressure, he had turned it into proof that he was the only one not owned by the system. Every day the shutdown continued. The story wrote itself, an outsider standing against a corrupt alliance of politicians and corporations. By the time government doors reopened, the landscape had already shifted. The shutdown, once intended to crush Trump's credibility, had become his platform. Schumer's weapon had backfired spectacularly. The narrative of control, the belief that Washington could dictate the limits of power, had fractured. And from that fracture, something new was emerging. The crisis had exposed a deeper divide than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't about policy anymore. It was about trust. When the shutdown ended, Washington tried to exhale, but the calm that followed was not relief, it was disorientation. The government machinery groaned back to life, but the energy that once powered it felt drained. What had happened wasn't just a budget standoff, it was an inversion of power. Trump had taken an old tool of control and turned it into an instrument of exposure. The political class, still dizzy from the reversal, didn't yet understand what it was facing. They assumed the episode would fade like every other crisis, that attention would reset. Outrage would cool, and the country would return to its habits. But this time, the center of gravity had shifted. The people who had watched the shutdown from their living rooms hadn't just seen dysfunction, they had seen how easily the system turned against itself. They had seen that the gears of bureaucracy didn't stop because of principle, they stopped because no one trusted anyone to fix them. The healthcare proposal that detonated Washington continued to echo across the country. Even without legislation, it had already redefined the political landscape. The simplicity of the idea, direct trust in citizens over corporations, had become contagious. Talk radio, podcasts, even dinner-table conversations carried the same undercurrent of rebellion. If government funds could go straight to people for healthcare, why not for education, housing, or food? Why should middlemen decide what individuals deserve? Schumer's caucus tried to contain the spread, labeling Trump's message a dangerous populist illusion. But the language that once carried moral authority had turned sterile. The establishment spoke of oversight, of regulation, of the importance of centralized systems. It was the vocabulary of management in a country that no longer wanted to be managed. Each warning about risk sounded like condescension, each appeal to expertise like arrogance. Trump's circle recognized this shift instantly. What began as a tactical response during the shutdown became the blueprint for a larger strategy, one that blurred the boundaries between governance and movement. He began to present every policy not as a law to be passed, but as a correction to a broken system. Each proposal aimed directly at the emotional core of everyday life: healthcare, food, housing, wages. The message was consistent. The system had stopped working because it stopped trusting the people it served. The reaction outside Washington was visceral. Voters who had long drifted from politics started paying attention again, not out of loyalty but curiosity. They weren't joining a party, they were aligning with an instinct. Trump had done something that no consultant could manufacture. He had made distrust feel like clarity. Inside the Senate, the atmosphere was heavier than before. Schumer's authority, once unquestioned, had started to erode. Conversations that once took place behind closed doors were now leaking to the press. Private doubts about strategy. Murmurs of generational divide. The confidence that Democrats had projected during the shutdown was gone, replaced by an edge of confusion. They had built an identity on protecting the underdog, but now looked like defenders of the status quo. The transformation was psychological as much as political. The media tried to restore balance, but balance had become impossible. Every attempt to frame the president's ideas as reckless backfired, feeding the perception that elites feared giving people control. Editorials warning of economic instability and policy naivete read like confessions of weakness. The press had lost its monopoly on narrative. In the Oval Office, Trump kept his pace measured, almost casual. He didn't need to push harder. Momentum was already working for him. His opposition was fighting gravity itself, trying to convince the public to unsee what they had already seen. The government's authority, once unquestioned, now looked contingent. The idea that bureaucrats knew better had been punctured, and no amount of statistics could patch it. The old language of politics, compromise, process, bipartisanship, sounded ceremonial now, like a language spoken by ghosts. Trump wasn't offering unity. He was offering clarity. The promise wasn't that government would fix everything. It was that it would finally get out of the way. Washington could sense the imbalance long before it admitted it. The city's rituals carried on, the hearings, the Sunday shows, the sterile debates, but they had lost their gravity. The old political choreography had turned hollow, its rhythm mismatched with the country beyond the Beltway. What had once been a contest of ideology was mutating into something rawer, simpler, and infinitely more dangerous for those who had built their lives on control. The shutdown was supposed to be a lesson in discipline, a demonstration that power flowed through institutions and not personalities. Instead, it revealed that personality had become the new institution. The president's defiance wasn't merely a tactic, it was a signal to millions who had grown tired of being managed by people who didn't live like them. The shock was not that Trump had survived the siege, but that he had emerged from it stronger, his message sharper, his instincts vindicated. The healthcare proposal remained the symbol of that inversion. It was more than a policy, it was a thesis. The idea that the citizen could be trusted more than the system that claimed to protect him had detonated inside the American psyche. Polls showed an unexpected shift. Skepticism toward corporations had fused with skepticism toward government itself, forming a single current of populist distrust that transcended party. Democrats were trapped defending an arrangement that looked, to the public, indistinguishable from corruption. Schumer's staff crafted counterarguments, data-heavy briefings meant to reassert control. They described Trump's plan as unworkable, inefficient, fiscally reckless, but numbers no longer mattered. The conversation had left the realm of economics and entered the terrain of belief. It was no longer about feasibility, it was about faith in one's own capacity to choose. The very concept of expertise, once the foundation of liberal legitimacy, now sounded elitist. The establishment was discovering that in an age of transparency, knowledge no longer guaranteed trust. Outside the Capitol, the effects multiplied. Conservative media framed the proposal as liberation, while even moderate commentators conceded that the president had struck a nerve. The old language of politics, incremental reform, bipartisan compromise, had been replaced by something elemental. It was not about left or right. It was about control or autonomy. Every argument Schumer's allies made against Trump's ideas only deepened the divide between those who believed citizens needed supervision and those who believed supervision was the problem itself. In that atmosphere, the traditional levers of power no longer worked. Pressure, persuasion, shame, all of them relied on the assumption that people still believed the institutions applying them were legitimate. They didn't. The Washington Consensus, the unspoken agreement that governance must flow through managed systems, was dissolving before its architects' eyes. Trump's team understood what was happening. They had no need for detailed blueprints or legislative roadmaps. The movement fed itself on mood. The president's next gestures followed the same rhythm. Investigations into monopolistic food distributors accused of manipulating prices. Proposals for unconventional mortgages to make homeownership accessible to younger families. Symbolic orders to cut out the middleman. Each announcement followed the same pattern. Identify the frustration everyone feels but no one addresses. Expose the layer of bureaucracy behind it. Then declare that the people can do better. The details were irrelevant. The symbolism was everything. The power of that strategy lay in its consistency. Each move reinforced the central narrative that trust was no longer something granted upward but reclaimed outward. The political class, which had spent decades perfecting the art of explanation, found itself drowning in its own vocabulary. Every press conference meant to clarify only confused further. Every statement about responsibility sounded like an admission of guilt. Inside Schumer's circle, the atmosphere turned heavy with introspection. Some aides urged confrontation, publicly dismantled Trump's ideas, labeled them fantasy. Others whispered about adaptation, about finding a way to co-opt the language of direct trust before it erased them completely. But the dilemma was existential. To embrace the populist argument was to admit that their own system had failed. To reject it was to seem afraid of the people they claimed to represent. Trump's genius wasn't in inventing new ideas but in rearranging the moral geometry of old ones. By positioning himself as the champion of individual agency, he forced his opponents into the role of paternalists defending systems that restrained it. Every press statement Schumer's office released in defense of the subsidies was interpreted as proof that Democrats preferred gatekeepers to citizens. The optics were merciless. Across the country, state governors began experimenting with the rhetoric of decentralization. Some launched pilot programs inspired by the direct trust model. Others, wary of openly crediting the president, rebranded similar concepts under different names. The trend was unmistakable. Authority was diffusing, leaking outward through the cracks in the old order. The Washington establishment still wrote the rules, but the rules no longer commanded belief. For decades, control had been the hidden currency of politics, the belief that expertise justified intervention. That complexity required guardians. The shutdown shattered that illusion. What replaced it wasn't ideology but defiance. A belief that people could navigate their own risks better than bureaucracies could manage them. Trump hadn't created that sentiment, he had given it a language. The Democratic establishment tried to regain footing through outrage. Speeches were made about the dangers of demagoguery, the importance of institutional stability, the fragility of democracy, but the tone betrayed fear. The more they invoked stability, the more the public heard stagnation. The more they warned about populism, the more it sounded like nostalgia for a world where their words still mattered. Trump, watching the backlash unfold, moved carefully. He didn't need to respond directly. The spectacle of his enemies unraveling was its own validation. The lesson of the shutdown had taught him that silence could be as strategic as speech. His absence became presence. Each time Schumer's coalition attacked him, they reminded voters of the very system they now distrusted. What the political elite failed to grasp was that the center had already collapsed. Power was no longer concentrated. It was diffused into millions of small rebellions, families choosing to relocate, entrepreneurs refusing compliance, voters abandoning party identity. The populist wave was not coordinated. not even entirely conscious. It was simply the consequence of a country deciding it no longer needed permission to act. Inside the marble corridors of Congress, Schumer began to look like a man arguing with history. He still commanded the podium, still delivered statements that filled the evening news, but the audience had moved elsewhere. Even his allies in media struggled to keep up. The cadence of political discourse had changed. It no longer flowed through institutions but around them, like a river carving new paths through forgotten ground. The transformation was subtle but absolute. Washington's power had always depended on belief in competence, in hierarchy, in control. Once that belief eroded, the city's authority became a shadow of itself. The shutdown had not just frozen government operations, it had revealed how thin the ice beneath them truly was. Trump's countermove, born from the ashes of that standoff, was more than strategy. It was a declaration that control itself was the enemy. He had turned the mechanisms of accountability, press scrutiny, institutional resistance, political negotiation, into proof that the old system no longer served the public. It was political judo executed at a national scale. And it worked because it aligned with something deeper than partisanship. It aligned with exhaustion. By the time Schumer's advisors realized the scope of what had happened, the narrative was gone for good. The president's populist realignment had escaped Washington's containment. It had become an idea, elastic, adaptable, spreading through every conversation about what it meant to be governed. No committee could legislate against it. No editorial could undo it. And as the Senate floor emptied one quiet afternoon, the leader who had once controlled the rhythm of the chamber found himself staring into a silence that felt different than before. It wasn't the silence of victory or defeat. It was the silence that follows when the center of power shifts away, and those who once held it realize they are now only spectators to the new world forming outside their walls. The government was open again. The lights were on, but the architecture of belief that had held Washington together for generations was cracked beyond repair. What began as a shutdown had become a signal, and what started as a battle between two men had become a reckoning with the entire system that produced them. New York had always been a city that believed its own mythology. It could burn, flood, riot, and rebuild, all without losing the conviction that it was the center of gravity for everything that mattered. The skyline was its sermon and the pulse of its ambition. But the illusion of permanence was beginning to crack. The night Zohran Mamdani won the mayor's race, the city felt for a brief moment as if it had turned a page in history. Supporters filled the streets chanting his name, waving banners painted in the soft blues and reds of progressivism reborn. Cameras captured tears, cheers, the choreography of a movement convinced it was about to redeem the failures of the past decade. The narrative wrote itself. A new kind of leader had arrived. One untouched by the cynicism that had buried the old order. For a week, New York allowed itself to believe. Editorials hailed a generational shift, the ascendance of idealism over cynicism. Mamdani was portrayed as a symbol of moral clarity, a man of the people ready to drag the city's institutions into the light. His speeches promised free programs, affordable housing, public renewal. His voice carried the rhythm of certainty that every revolution needs in its early days. But beneath the celebration was a tension that no one wanted to acknowledge. The promises were enormous, the expectations larger still, and the arithmetic behind them whispered contradiction. The facade began to crack almost instantly. Within days of his victory, whispers turned to stories, stories to headlines. Photos emerged from a luxury resort in Puerto Rico, a conference. Donors, lobbyists, champagne under a tropical sun. The same candidate who had denounced privilege as moral rot was already surrounded by the very class he had built his campaign against. The imagery was fatal. The optics of hypocrisy were sharper than any scandal. They didn't require proof, only contrast. The movement that had declared war on elites suddenly looked indistinguishable from them. The unraveling quickened. Mamdani announced his transition team with theatrical flourish. Framed as an act of symbolic justice, an all-women team. A historic first. The media applauded the optics. But scrutiny followed quickly. The names revealed ties to the same network of lobbyists, consultants, and operatives that had circulated through every administration since Bloomberg. The rhetoric of disruption had been replaced by the reality of rotation. Beneath the new branding, it was the same architecture of influence. The donors had changed addresses, not philosophy. The disappointment was immediate and corrosive. Supporters who had filled the streets on election night began to ask questions. The city's faith, fragile and brief, started to erode. The narrative of revolution gave way to the oldest story in politics: power consuming its profits. Mamdani's administration hadn't even begun, and already it was defending contradictions rather than defining ideals. He blamed misinterpretation, logistics, transition fatigue, anything that could buy time. But time was the one thing New York no longer gave. Then came the fundraising letters. Emails sent to supporters asking for contributions to fund the transition, despite the fact that the process was publicly financed. The symbolism was catastrophic. The man who had built his campaign on giving things away now appeared to be asking his base to pay for his ascension. It wasn't greed that doomed him. It was the insult of it. The betrayal of tone. In politics, money scandals are common, but hypocrisy is fatal. The shift in mood could be measured in motion. Real estate brokers in Miami, Palm Beach, and Boca Raton began reporting a spike in calls from New York clients within 48 hours of the election. Private jet charters recorded their busiest week since the pandemic. Something deeper than politics was happening. Wealth, talent, and ambition were fleeing not because of taxes or policy yet, but because of anticipation, a recognition that the city's next chapter would be written by ideology rather than pragmatism. It wasn't simply an exodus, it was preemption. The numbers told the story. A surge of contracts in South Florida, waterfront properties selling in days, developers doubling forecasts overnight. The city that had once drawn the ambitious was now exporting them. The narrative of progress had mutated into a migration. Florida's governor called it a vote with your feet. But it was more than that. It was the visible symptom of a broader disillusionment, a collective admission that competence had become unfashionable. Mamdani's team dismissed the coverage as hysteria, but the optics wouldn't fade. Each attempt to explain only deepened the impression of insincerity. Every word about equity sounded like branding. Every promise like a recycled slogan. The administration hadn't even begun, and already it was a study in entropy. What had been sold as revolution was dissolving into a mirror of the establishment it vowed to overthrow. The press, initially protective, began to turn. Reporters who had celebrated his rise now dissected his contradictions with forensic delight. The same outlets that had hailed him as the face of a new generation now described a governing vacuum. Late-night monologues, once affectionate, turned cutting. In a city addicted to momentum, ridicule was the final stage of relevance. The blue mirage, the image of purity projected onto a sea of dysfunction, was beginning to vanish. The collapse wasn't only political, it was existential. For decades, New York had functioned as a symbol of managed chaos, proof that even excess could be controlled if guided by intelligence. But the new order wasn't built on intelligence, it was built on symbolism. The idea that rhetoric could replace arithmetic, that virtue could substitute for competence. It worked as performance until it had to function as policy. And when reality arrived, it demanded receipts. The people leaving weren't just billionaires shielding their assets. They were small business owners exhausted by regulation, young families priced out of promise, even municipal employees who had voted for Mamdani but no longer trusted his vision. The pattern echoed across decades of American urban decline: promise the impossible. Spend until the numbers collapse. Blame the rich when they flee. What made this iteration different was the speed. Technology amplified disillusionment. News traveled faster than denial. The illusion could no longer outpace its own unraveling. As weeks passed, the flight accelerated. Realtors in Florida began calling the phenomenon Mamdani momentum. Local investors rushed to buy before the northern flood arrived, speculating on panic as profit. The southern skyline rose with cranes and ambition, a mirror inversion of the north's slow decay. It was capitalism's cruel symmetry, ideology collapsing in one city while opportunity bloomed in another. Back in New York, the administration doubled down. Instead of humility, there was defiance. Press conferences framed criticism as conspiracy, defection as greed, but every defense sounded brittle. The mayor's office began to resemble a stage set, bright lights, hollow interiors. City agencies stalled under indecision. Programs announced with fanfare quietly froze. The dream of egalitarian renewal had become an exercise in bureaucratic paralysis. The story wasn't new, but its acceleration was. The cycle that had taken Chicago decades or Detroit generations was unfolding in months. The exodus of capital triggered a decline in revenue, which led to higher taxes, which accelerated the departure of those still able to leave. The pattern fed on itself. Economists had a term for it: fiscal inversion. Residents called it something simpler: escape. Beyond the numbers, the symbolism was devastating. The progressive utopia that had been sold as the antidote to inequality was now the engine of it. The city that once preached inclusion had become a lesson in flight. Even those who stayed began to adapt quietly, insulating their lives from the state's reach, learning to live within the inefficiencies they could no longer change. The rhetoric of unity had given way to the reality of fragmentation. From Washington, Trump watched the unraveling like a man observing proof of his own argument. The story wrote itself, while progressives in New York dismantled prosperity in the name of virtue. He was rebuilding the narrative of trust in the individual. The juxtaposition was perfect, almost cinematic. Schumer's strategic failure in the Capitol and Mamdani's ideological collapse in New York became twin mirrors reflecting the same truth: control masquerading as compassion always ends in decay. New York's slow-motion implosion spread beyond city limits. Other progressive enclaves, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, felt the tremor. Populations dipped, budgets strained. The rhetoric of equity collided with the mathematics of sustainability. Each city believed it was exceptional. Each followed the same script. The media coined a phrase for it: the blue mirage, a shimmering promise that disappeared on contact with reality. In the end, what remained wasn't anger but fatigue. The people who left didn't curse the city, they simply stopped believing it could change. The ones who stayed adjusted expectations downward, redefining survival as success. The revolution had not been crushed, it had evaporated. What lingered was an empty slogan echoing through hollow corridors of City Hall. The aftersound of a movement that mistook theater for governance. The contrast between Washington's new populism and New York's failed idealism drew a map of America's transformation. In one, a system learning to survive by trusting citizens. In the other, a city collapsing because it no longer trusted them at all. And as the lights of Manhattan shimmered over the Hudson, they looked less like symbols of power than reflections on the surface of a fading illusion. The migration began quietly, like a rumor that no one wanted to believe. It was easy at first to dismiss the early reports as coincidence: a few restless executives, a handful of families chasing lower taxes and better weather. But soon the evidence grew impossible to ignore. Moving vans lined the streets of the Upper East Side. Storage facilities filled overnight. Private airfields outside the city recorded record traffic southbound. Brokers in Palm Beach and Miami no longer spoke of seasons but of waves. Each new client arrived with the same weary confession: they were tired of being punished for trying to stay afloat. The exodus was not only about money, it was about mood. The tone of northern cities had changed, as if ambition itself had been recast as a sin. Policies written in the name of fairness began to feel like retribution. The language of progress had hardened into command. Florida, by contrast, offered something simpler and older: a promise not of paradise but of permission. The state's skyline was expanding as fast as its reputation. a refuge for those who wanted to build rather than apologize. Developers called it the great pivot of the decade. Data analysts called it demographic realignment. But to those leaving, it felt like escape. The Northern Corridor had become a museum of control, curfews, mandates, restrictions layered upon restrictions. Florida was the counterimage, the last open frontier where governance still pretended to trust its citizens. The difference was cultural before it was political. In New York, the language of leadership had become parental. In Florida, it sounded fraternal. The financials told the same story. In a matter of months, Florida's real estate market ignited. Condominiums that had lingered for years sold in days. Land once written off as swamp turned into gold. The same developers who had fled New York bureaucracy now poured billions into South Florida's coastlines. Demand spiraled upward, driven not by speculation but by conviction that the center of American energy was moving south. The old hubs of influence, Manhattan, Chicago, Los Angeles, began to feel like archives. Beneath the numbers was something more profound, a migration of trust. Investors, entrepreneurs, and families were voting with geography. Each move south was an act of quiet rebellion, a declaration that competence mattered more than ideology. The new residents arrived with stories of frustration, a government that no longer functioned. Cities where laws multiplied faster than results. Mayors who spoke of equality but governed by decree. Florida became their antidote, a place that embodied the opposite principle. Do not fix what people can handle themselves. The change was visible even from the air. Where the northern skyline was sharp and vertical, the southern one was horizontal, sprawling, open. The architecture mirrored the psychology, space over density, movement over management. In every suburb and coastal town, construction cranes filled the horizon, their silhouettes like flags of a new frontier. The state was no longer just a retirement haven, it had become a migration of renewal. Economists were baffled by the velocity. Population growth outpaced projections by years. New corporations registered in clusters. Entire industries relocated. Florida's tax revenue swelled while northern states faced deficits that no accounting trick could disguise. Legislatures responded with panic, new surcharges, new regulations, desperate gestures to hold on to those already halfway gone. But the movement was beyond policy. It was emotional, psychological, a shift in the national temperament. Trump's allies called it vindication. His critics called it coincidence. But the parallel was undeniable. The same philosophy that had reshaped Washington, trust people, not bureaucracies, was now manifesting in the real world. The migration south was the physical embodiment of that idea. Every moving truck was a referendum. Every new business registered in Florida was a vote against the illusion of control. From Tallahassee to Miami, leaders capitalized on the moment. They branded their state as the future: open markets, open schools, open skies. The contrast with the North grew sharper with each news cycle. While New York debated new regulations on property and energy, Florida passed tax cuts and infrastructure projects that signaled acceleration rather than restraint. The competition between models, managed virtue versus unregulated trust, was no longer theoretical. It was measurable in U-Haul receipts and flight logs. The sociologists called it a cultural inversion. The South, once mocked as backward, had become the new frontier of freedom. The North, once the emblem of sophistication, now looked bureaucratic and tired. Families that once saw relocation as surrender began to treat it as evolution. Retirees mixed with entrepreneurs, working-class families with financiers. The old social hierarchies blurred. Florida's population became a portrait of convergence, a cross-section of those unwilling to wait for permission. As the movement swelled, the northern press grew defensive. Editorials warned of brain drain, of reckless deregulation, of climate risk. But the warnings felt hollow, the tone too familiar. The public had stopped listening to sermons from those who had lost control of their own cities. The people leaving didn't respond with anger, they simply left. Their silence was the loudest indictment. By mid-year, the statistics read like fiction. Miami's housing index doubled. Palm Beach's luxury market tripled. Even inland cities, Orlando, Tampa, Jacksonville, absorbed thousands of new arrivals a week. The migration was so sudden that local infrastructure strained to keep pace. Roads clogged with construction trucks. Schools filled beyond capacity. Yet amid the chaos, there was optimism, a collective sense of motion that northern cities had lost. The dysfunction felt creative, not corrosive. It was more than economics, it was identity. For decades, cultural gravity had pointed north, to New York for finance, to Washington for power, to Los Angeles for fame. But the compass had shifted. Influence now flowed toward heat, not hierarchy. The entrepreneurs who had once needed proximity to the old centers of power realized they could operate anywhere. Technology had made geography fluid, but leadership had made it matter again. Florida was not just absorbing people, it was absorbing the future. The irony was stark. The very policies that drove people away from northern cities had been designed to protect them. Safety became suffocation. Compassion turned into control. The architects of progress mistook regulation for virtue and efficiency for greed. Florida's rise was a rebuke written in population data. The message was simple and brutal: freedom works. Reporters visiting from New York described the mood with disbelief. Streets buzzing with construction, restaurants packed, business conferences expanding instead of closing. There was a vitality that no one could dismiss. An energy that belonged to places that still believed in growth. The contrast became a metaphor for the country itself, a divided nation not by ideology but by temperament. On one side, caution; on the other, acceleration. The political symbolism was unavoidable. Trump's allies saw the migration as validation of his core narrative: competence over control, trust over fear. The movement south was no longer just economic. It was spiritual. A mass decision to reject dependence. The former president had predicted it years earlier, framing Florida as a refuge for self-governance. Now reality had caught up with the metaphor. Schumer, watching from the Capitol, understood what the numbers meant even if he would never admit it publicly. The flow of capital, of families, of energy itself, was leaving the systems he represented. The ideological North, built on control and careful calibration, was bleeding into the pragmatic South, built on risk and instinct. The migration was erasing the line between political rhetoric and lived experience. In Tallahassee, the governor's office capitalized with precision. Speeches celebrated the Great Relocation, casting it as proof that the country's core was being rebuilt from the ground up. The imagery was deliberate: families on porches, small businesses opening at dawn, students in newly built schools. The message was the same one that had redefined Washington: the system doesn't need to manage you if it trusts you. Florida's growth became mythic, exaggerated even by its own boosters. But myths, when they align with momentum, become truth in motion. The state was no longer just a region, it was a narrative. The counterpoint to decay. Every mile driven south along Interstate 95 felt like an act of defiance. Every "for sale" sign in Manhattan felt like a surrender. As the new arrivals settled under the subtropical sun, a quiet sense of vindication took hold. They spoke of freedom the way people speak of survival. Their migration was not rebellion but recovery. They had escaped something, not a city, not a party, but a philosophy. And in their leaving, they exposed what the old centers refused to see: that trust is not a luxury of prosperity, but the foundation of it. The exodus south had become more than a demographic event. It was the map of a national reckoning, the physical manifestation of the divide that had begun in Washington's shutdown and deepened through New York's collapse. The movement was no longer reversible. The country was rearranging itself not through legislation, but through motion. As night fell over Miami's skyline, the cranes glowed like constellations, each one a symbol of creation born from retreat. The hum of construction replaced the echo of protest. And in that hum was a message as old as the Republic itself: when control fails, people move. The unraveling did not announce itself with explosions or headlines. It arrived like erosion, slow, silent, inevitable. Cities that had once pulsed with ambition began to dim, their skylines still majestic but hollow beneath the surface. The same pattern repeated itself across the map, from the rusting edges of Chicago to the sun-bleached sprawl of Los Angeles. What had once been engines of progress were now monuments to exhaustion. The collapse of control was not sudden. It was the quiet realization that the system's weight had exceeded its purpose. The first signs were statistical: populations shrinking, tax revenues faltering, small businesses disappearing faster than they could be replaced. Mayors delivered speeches about resilience, promising new initiatives that never arrived. The language of leadership became repetition, its rhythm like the hum of machinery long disconnected from power. Cities once defined by motion had become places that spoke only of the past. What united them was not geography or policy but delusion. Each believed its decline was unique, caused by circumstance rather than philosophy. They blamed economics, pandemics, migration, anything but themselves. Yet the symptoms were identical: bureaucracy expanding as productivity shrank, crime rising as accountability evaporated, infrastructure collapsing beneath programs meant to fix it. The more they tried to control, the less they could manage. Control itself had become the disease. New York was the template. After Mamdani's fall, the city drifted in a daze of self-preservation. Empty storefronts lined avenues once alive with commerce. Tax hikes passed under the banner of fairness only deepened flight. Committees formed to address the exodus but could not explain why no one wanted to stay. The rhythm of decline was mathematical. Every dollar chased from the city took two to replace. And each replacement came with new conditions. The government had become a machine that consumed its own creators. Chicago followed, its skyline still shining but its streets thinning. The narrative of safety and justice fractured beneath the numbers. Homicides rose. Businesses relocated, schools shuttered. The mayor's office spoke of systemic challenges, but the people spoke of leaving. Los Angeles fared no better. Encampments stretched for miles, the physical manifestation of a city whose compassion had become paralysis. In each case, the pattern held: promises built on redistribution collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions. Schumer's Washington watched these cities like a physician refusing to admit a diagnosis. Congressional hearings cited statistics but avoided causes. The same committees that debated the failures of healthcare now faced the failures of urban governance. And the parallels were unmistakable. Programs designed to help had become excuses to expand control, and every layer of oversight added another inefficiency. The illusion of management persisted long after results had disappeared. The public understood before the politicians did. Trust, the invisible currency of governance, had evaporated. Polls showed record lows in confidence toward every major institution: government, media, academia, even the justice system. People no longer believed in competence, only in proximity. They trusted those close enough to see, to touch, to know. The further removed power became, the less real it felt. In that vacuum, alternative models emerged: local councils, private cooperatives, self-funded schools, decentralized communities experimenting with independence. What once would have been dismissed as libertarian fantasy was now necessity. As cities faltered, citizens rebuilt governance in miniature, trading bureaucracy for immediacy. The state's absence was no longer failure, it was opportunity. Economists tried to explain the shift in rational terms: remote work, climate migration, economic realignment. But those were surface factors. The deeper current was philosophical. Americans were rediscovering something older than progressivism or conservatism: the idea that authority is only legitimate when it trusts the people it governs. After decades of centralization, the pendulum had swung too far, and now the recoil was unstoppable. The collapse of control was not chaos, it was adaptation. The old order mistook it for disintegration because it could not imagine life beyond its own rules. Yet across the nation, the signs of renewal were visible, small towns thriving as cities decayed. States experimenting with deregulation and innovation. Florida, Texas, Tennessee, the Carolinas, all became laboratories of autonomy. The competition between control and freedom had entered its decisive phase. Media outlets tried to maintain the narrative of stability, insisting that decentralization was dangerous, that expertise was indispensable, but the words no longer resonated. The public had watched too many experts fail, too many systems break under their own bureaucracy. Each scandal, corruption in city contracts, collapse of public transit, rising crime in zones labeled reformed, fed the same conclusion. The people in charge no longer believed in results, only in rhetoric. Trump's movement capitalized on the contrast. While progressive cities descended into managed decline, his rhetoric of trust and autonomy found tangible proof in every crumbling district. He didn't need to invent evidence. It was visible in abandoned factories and shuttered schools. Each failure of control validated his thesis that the system was rigged not by malice but by arrogance. He presented himself not as a savior but as a mirror, reflecting the failures his opponents refused to confront. The genius of his framing was that it didn't require perfection. He didn't promise utopia, he promised possibility. Where Schumer's politics spoke of systems, Trump spoke of instincts. The people, he argued, could do better not because they were smarter but because they were accountable to themselves. The contrast was devastating. Managed compassion versus autonomous competence. By the time Washington understood the magnitude of the transformation, it was too late. Federal influence over states began to weaken. Court battles over jurisdiction became the new frontiers of power. Governors challenged mandates. Cities defied funding conditions. Local communities built their own networks of service. Control had splintered, and in its fragmentation lay the seeds of renewal. The collapse of control was not destruction, it was decentralization disguised as disorder. The country was not falling apart, it was reorganizing itself around trust. The systems that refused to evolve were the ones dissolving first. Those that adapted, that relinquished authority back to the people, found themselves thriving in unexpected ways. The contrast was becoming undeniable. In the halls of the Senate, Schumer struggled to maintain composure. The man who had once orchestrated shutdowns and compromises now presided over a chamber that no longer commanded the country's pulse. The debates sounded procedural, irrelevant, disconnected from the pace of change outside the Capitol. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the authority of Congress evaporating into the autonomy of states. The collapse he had once tried to control was now controlling him. Across the ocean of America, a quiet clarity took shape. The cities that clung to control were dying by inches, their residents fleeing, their budgets imploding. The regions that embraced trust were expanding, absorbing the vitality that the old order had lost. The map was redrawing itself, not by legislation but by movement. Every relocation, every new enterprise, every vote cast against control was a data point in a revolution that required no manifesto. The country was dividing, not in anger but in divergence. One side clung to systems that promised fairness but delivered dependence. The other built new systems around trust, risk, and responsibility. The tension between them was no longer theoretical, it was existential. Control had been the glue of the 20th century. Autonomy was becoming the engine of the 21st. The collapse of control revealed something that had been forgotten in the noise of governance. That order imposed from above decays faster than trust built from below. And as the cities that once ruled the nation crumbled under the weight of their own illusions, the people quietly reclaimed what had always been theirs, the right to decide for themselves. The marble halls of Washington still echoed with speeches about unity and strength. But outside, the sound was different. It was the noise of construction, of migration, of motion. The hum of engines and hammers replaced the rhetoric of reform. The collapse was not the end. It was the clearing of ground for something new. By the time the dust settled, the country no longer resembled the one that had entered the shutdown. The old scaffolding of power still stood, but it was hollow, a shell of rituals and titles without the energy that once animated it. Washington continued to speak the language of order, but it had lost the authority to define it. The real momentum lived elsewhere, in small towns building their own economies, in states charting their own rules, in millions of citizens who had stopped waiting for permission to move forward. America had not collapsed, it had pivoted. The pivot was not a revolution of ideology but of instinct. For decades, the country had been managed through fear of markets failing, fear of inequality, fear of losing control. The response to every failure had been the same: more oversight, more management, more layers of expertise. But control had reached its limit. When the system could no longer deliver stability, people stopped believing in its necessity. They began to trust themselves instead. Trump, who had long been dismissed as chaos personified, became the unlikely architect of this transformation. His politics were never about policy in the conventional sense. They were about inversion, turning dependence into defiance, transforming outrage into ownership. The shutdown, Schumer's collapse, Mamdani's implosion, and the flight to Florida had all been chapters of the same story, a nation rediscovering that trust was stronger than control. What had begun as disruption had become doctrine. The new American story took shape in quiet acts rather than grand gestures. Families opening small businesses outside city limits, states rewriting their tax codes to reward initiative, farmers forming digital cooperatives, teachers founding independent schools. Each action was local, but together they formed a pattern, a slow redistribution of power from the abstract to the tangible. The federal government still functioned, but it no longer felt central. It was a backdrop, not a director. The political establishment misread the moment. They saw chaos where there was construction. They mistook decentralization for decline. Yet beneath the noise, the logic was unmistakable. The country was reorganizing itself around trust. The new alignment wasn't left or right, it was vertical versus horizontal. Hierarchy versus network. Power was no longer a pyramid but a web, alive and shifting, impossible to control from the top. Schumer, once the maestro of legislative leverage, became a figure of another era. He continued to deliver speeches about unity, about protecting the institutions that had defined his life's work. But even he could feel the air thinning around him, the words echoing without response. The more he appealed to order, the more he seemed a relic of the very control people were leaving behind. History had moved on, and it had not asked his permission. Trump, on the other hand, moved like a man who understood timing better than ideology. He no longer needed to argue. Reality was arguing for him. The Department of Justice investigations into corporate price manipulation, the proposal for extended mortgages, the defiance of federal overreach, all of it fit into a single narrative of return, power to the people who use it, not the institutions that hoard it. It was less a campaign than a correction. The irony was that his vision was not purely conservative or populist. It was pragmatic. It borrowed freely from left and right, blending market logic with populist empathy, skepticism with optimism. It was an instinctive realignment rather than a philosophical one, a reminder that governance, at its best, is not ideology imposed from above but freedom maintained from below. For many Americans, it felt like the first political language that matched their reality. The shift was visible in how people spoke. Words like policy and program began to fade, replaced by choice, ownership, agency. The vocabulary of governance had evolved. It was less about administration and more about participation. Citizens no longer wanted to be managed, they wanted to be trusted. Every success story from Florida, Texas, Tennessee, states where control had loosened and opportunity expanded, became evidence that the pivot was real. For the establishment, the change was disorienting. The tools they had relied upon, polls, Focus groups, messaging strategies, stopped working. Voters were unpredictable, not because they were fickle but because they had stopped identifying as part of predictable blocks. They were making decisions issue by issue, life by life. The old categories, Democrat, Republican, Liberal, Conservative, were dissolving into irrelevance. In their place was something fluid, a coalition defined not by ideology but by autonomy. The cities that once set the cultural tone of the nation were losing their grip. The conversations that mattered now began in places that had never been considered centers of power: school board meetings, small town halls, online communities that built their own momentum. The political class, still addicted to the theater of Washington, failed to see that the audience had left the room. The American pivot was already underway, and no speech could slow it. The collapse of control had birthed something paradoxically stable, a new trust economy. Not of money but of belief. People were investing their faith horizontally, in one another, rather than vertically, in institutions. The effect was cultural as much as political. Churches grew again, not out of doctrine but out of community. Independent media replaced legacy outlets as arbiters of truth. The center was gone, but cohesion had not vanished. It had simply dispersed. Trump's genius, whether deliberate or instinctive, was understanding that chaos could be domesticated. He recognized that Americans were no longer afraid of disorder, they were afraid of stagnation. His politics did not eliminate uncertainty but redefined it as opportunity. The old system had taught people to fear risk, the new one rewarded them for taking it. For millions, this was liberation. The elites misinterpreted this as populism's last gasp. But they were wrong. It was its evolution. The populism of resentment had become the populism of renewal. The anger that once fueled protest was transforming into creation. People weren't just rejecting control, they were building alternatives. The pivot was no longer about Trump alone. It was about a cultural awakening he had accelerated but could not contain. In Florida, the experiment became visible proof. Infrastructure expanded. Businesses multiplied. Schools reopened under local governance. Critics warned that deregulation would bring disaster. But prosperity contradicted them. The state's success stories became parables told across the nation: growth through trust, stability through freedom. Each headline about another northern city's decline made the southern skyline glow brighter. Meanwhile, in New York, Mamdani's administration sank into irrelevance. Buried under debt and scandal, the city had become an allegory of overreach, a warning carved in concrete and steel. Its downfall served as the mirror opposite of Florida's ascent: one city that trusted the system more than its people, another that trusted its people more than its system. The outcome was undeniable. The pivot was not without danger. Freedom, once unleashed, resists direction. Some states overreached in the other direction, cutting too deep, confusing autonomy with anarchy. Others struggled with the growing divide between regions of abundance and regions of collapse. But even in chaos, there was purpose. The country was learning again through trial, the way it had always evolved, imperfectly, painfully, freely. Schumer's legacy, once measured in bills passed and deals brokered, now existed mostly in retrospection. History would remember him as the last master of an old system, the final craftsman of centralized politics. Trump would be remembered differently, not as a destroyer, but as the man who revealed the machinery behind the curtain and dared the audience to walk away. Their rivalry had not just shaped a political era, it had birthed a philosophical divide that would define the next one. As the decade turned, the transformation was visible in everything from the markets to the skyline. The population curve bent toward freedom, the economy toward decentralization, culture toward authenticity. The pendulum of history, stalled for years in the name of stability, was finally swinging again. America was rediscovering what it had nearly forgotten: that freedom is not chaos, and trust is not naivete. The pivot had begun as a political event, but it ended as a moral one. It was a correction not of policy, but of faith, faith misplaced in the few, reclaimed by the many. from the quiet suburbs of the south to the hollowed towers of the north. The same conclusion echoed: control breeds decay, but trust creates movement. And so the nation moved, not in unison but in purpose, reshaping itself without orders, redistributing belief from the hands of the powerful to the hearts of the ordinary. The old America, managed and measured, had given way to something unpredictable and alive. As the lights of Washington flickered across the Potomac, they no longer symbolized command but memory. Power had migrated, southward, outward, everywhere. The country that once waited for direction had remembered how to move on its own. And in that motion lay the true pivot, not the rise of a leader, but the return of a people who had finally remembered that freedom, once trusted, takes care of itself.